Long before Jesus rose from the dead, long before any Messiah ever walked the earth, a woman had already descended into the abyss, gathered the shattered fragments of a destroyed love, and forced the universe to bend its own rules. She wasn't just a goddess, she was the great magic, the only divine being that even the Egyptian gods themselves feared. And the most disturbing secret of all, she got her power by tricking the supreme god of the universe. How did an ordinary Egyptian woman become the most worshipped entity in history? A cult that survived over 3,500 years and spread all the way to Rome, Greece, and beyond? The answer lives inside the oldest myth of love, betrayal, and resurrection the world has ever known.
Mythology and the unconscious.
In the beginning, there was only the chaos of primordial waters. But from the union of Geb, god of the earth, and Nut, goddess of the sky, 4 pillars of creation were born: Osiris, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. Isis was born on a day between days, a moment that didn't exist on any calendar, stolen by Thoth, the god of wisdom, through a dice game with the moon itself. From the very start, she was different. Her name, Aset in ancient Egyptian, means simply the throne. Not a queen sitting on the throne, she was the throne. Real power didn't flow from the pharaoh, it flowed from her, the one who held him up. But Isis had a hunger no title could satisfy. She wanted the most guarded secret in the universe, the true name of Ra. Every being in the universe holds a true name, a word of power that contains their entire essence. To know something's true name is to have absolute control over it. And Isis knew this. She had noticed that Ra, the supreme sun god, was aging. His divine saliva dripped into the sand as he walked. With cold intelligence and surgical precision, Isis mixed Ra's saliva with sacred earth and sculpted a serpent. Not just any serpent. She created the solar cobra, a creature born from the very essence of the supreme god. When Ra was bitten and fell into agony, no god could heal the wound, only the one who had made the venom. Isis approached with a calm, dark smile. "I can heal you," she said, "but I need your true name." In desperation, Ra surrendered it. In that moment, Isis became more powerful than any god in the Egyptian pantheon. The lesson: real power doesn't come from brute force. It comes from the knowledge nobody else has. Then came the betrayal. Set, consumed by a hatred that had burned for eons, murdered Osiris, Isis's husband, the love of her existence, and sealed his body inside a golden sarcophagus thrown into the Nile. When the news reached her, Isis didn't weep. She moved. She cut her hair, dressed in mourning, and set out on the most desperate search in mythological history. She found him in Byblos, Lebanon, where the sarcophagus had fused with the trunk of a great tamarisk tree that had grown around the coffin, as if embracing a sleeping king. She brought the body home, but Set wasn't finished. While she slept by the Nile, he found the body, dismembered Osiris into 14 pieces, and scattered them across Egypt and beyond. His goal wasn't just to kill Osiris, it was to destroy the very possibility of his resurrection. With her sister Nephthys at her side, Isis crossed Egypt from north to south, east to west. She found 13 of the 14 pieces of Osiris's body. The 14th, his phallus, the center of masculine creative power, had been swallowed by a Nile fish and was lost forever in the deep. But Isis didn't stop. She summoned Thoth, master of words of power, and together they performed the most complex magical ritual ever described in any human tradition. She crafted a golden replacement and recited the Heka, the spells that move reality itself. Then she transformed into a kite of pure light, and there, between life and death, between the possible and the impossible, she generated life from a dead body. She conceived Horus, heir to the throne. Then she allowed Osiris to descend into the Duat, the underworld, where he would become the eternal judge of the dead. She didn't just save her love, she rewrote the rules of existence. But what if I told you the myth of Isis never stayed locked in Egypt? Historians and archaeologists have documented that the cult of Isis spread throughout the Greco-Roman world between the 4th century BCE and the 4th century CE, becoming one of the most powerful religions across the ancient Mediterranean. Her temple at Philae in Nubia was the last pagan temple forcibly closed by Christians in 537 CE. Over 1,000 years of uninterrupted worship. And that's only the beginning. The iconography of Isis sitting and nursing the infant Horus directly influenced early Christian representations of the Virgin Mary nursing Jesus. The cult of Isis even reached Roman Britain. Altars dedicated to her have been found in London. She wasn't just an Egyptian goddess, she was the most universal archetype in human history. But what if this 3,500-year-old myth isn't really a story about Egyptian gods at all? What if it is the most precise psychological map ever created for understanding the human psyche and the journey of anyone who has ever lost something essential and had to rebuild? For Carl Jung, the gods don't live on Mount Olympus. They live in the collective unconscious, the deepest layer of the human mind shared by all of humanity since the beginning of time. And Isis? She isn't just a mythological character. She is the most complete and most powerful archetype Jung identified across his entire body of work. Within Jung's archetypal framework, Isis simultaneously occupies 3 positions that rarely coexist in a single symbol. She is the Great Mother, the archetype of care, nurturing, and unconditional protection. She is the Anima, the intuitive, magical, and emotional dimension of the psyche that every human being carries, regardless of gender. And she is the wise woman, the keeper of knowledge that transcends rational logic. When Isis collects the 14 pieces of Osiris, she is doing what Jungian psychology calls shadow work, descending into the depths of the unconscious, finding what was destroyed, fragmented, repressed, and having the courage to reconnect it. Each piece of Osiris scattered across Egypt is a fragment of the psyche that life has shattered in you, the self-confidence destroyed by betrayal, the creativity suffocated by fear, the joy lost to trauma. There's one scene in the myth that Jung would have analyzed with particular attention. The moment Isis crafts the golden phallus to replace the lost piece. Psychologically, this represents something profound.
The piece that was devoured, lost forever, cannot be recovered, but it can be recreated in gold. This is what Jungians call the synthesis of opposites, the capacity to transform irreparable loss into something that surpasses the original. The golden phallus is more valuable than the original one made of flesh. In the same way, a psyche that has passed through destruction and reintegrated itself is more solid, more conscious, more whole than it was before the crisis. And the Heka, Isis's spells, aren't primitive superstition. In modern language, they are intentional affirmation, the narrative the psyche tells itself to rebuild its identity. Language creates reality. The Egyptians knew this 3,500 years ago. Act 8. The individuation process according to Isis. The myth of Isis maps with startling precision what Jung called the individuation process, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness. First, Paradise Lost. Osiris and Isis reigning in harmony represents integrated consciousness before the trauma. Then, fragmentation. The murder and dismemberment is the crisis that shatters identity. Next, the descent. Isis doesn't run from the pain. She goes after it, piece by piece. This is what Jung calls enantiodromia, the necessity of diving into the opposite to find balance. Then, integration, gathering the pieces, accepting what can't be recovered, and creating something new with what remains. Finally, transcendence. Horus is born. A new self emerges, not the same as before, but something more evolved, forged by loss and wisdom. You don't need to be Egyptian to live this myth. You live it every single time you lose something essential and have the courage to refuse to let that loss define the end of your story.
Isis, the anima, great mother, wise woman, represents the intuitive and integrative capacity of the psyche. She is emotional wisdom that knows when to fight, when to wait, and when to create. Psychologically, Isis is the inner voice that says, I can reconnect what was broken, even when logic says it's impossible. Osiris, the self, or higher ego, is the organizing principle of consciousness. His fragmentation represents the collapse of the central self during deep crisis, what contemporary psychology calls dissociation or identity rupture. Set, the shadow, the repressed and destructive aspect of the psyche, the rage, the jealousy, the inner chaos that surfaces when the ego ignores its darker parts for too long. But crucially, Set cannot be destroyed, only integrated. Horus, the divine child or new ego, is the possible future. Horus isn't born despite the trauma. He is born because of it. He is the renewed self, more conscious than Osiris's original ego ever was. The core teaching. Wholeness is not the original state of harmony. Wholeness is the state conquered after fragmentation, searching, and reintegration. The wound is the portal. The search for the pieces is the therapy. And the gold that replaces what cannot be recovered is wisdom, the only element that no betrayal, no loss, and no Set can ever destroy. So, now, are you the Isis who has already begun the journey of collection, gathering the pieces of your own identity back together? Drop in the comments what you think about this myth, and tell us which myth or archetype you want us to dive deep into next. Subscribe and hit the bell. Until our next descent into the unconscious.